RCMP numbers released in 2014 revealed that over 1,000 Indigenous women were either missing or victims of homicide in this country since 1980. The Globe and Mail calculated that an Indigenous woman is 7 times more likely to be slain by a serial killer than non-Indigenous women. These reports only confirm what First Peoples have been saying for years, that Aboriginal women are highly vulnerable, targeted, and victimized at a disproportionate rate in this country. And finally, in response to this, we've seen the creation of the long called for inquiry into missing and murdered women, launched September 1st of 2016. As we wait for the work of the inquiry to be completed, musician, speaker, and teacher Dr. Cheryl Bear joins me to talk about the prevalence of violence against her community. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me here.
Those are really sobering statistics. I was shocked, and I'm sure many viewers were shocked to hear that an Indigenous woman is 7 times more likely to be targeted by a serial killer. Were you aware of that?
Yes, yeah, I did a lot of work in the 90s on the downtown east side, and as soon as I arrived there to plant a church, street church, we heard on the street, just, be careful, there's a serial killer here, and, and it was just scary. But then, to hear that Indigenous women are victimized more than any other people group, it brings it all home, and it's sort of like, oh no, right? Because this is, like you said, this is us. This is me, right?
I think one of the reasons that we felt it was important to speak about is that a lot of people can get disconnected if you don't have Indigenous friends, if you are not near a community or part of a community that's experiencing this. A lot of times we don't know about it, and we're disconnected from the headlines. So I do think it's important that people know. But tell me why this is happening. I mean, that's a really big question. I mean, there's a whole inquiry trying to figure out why this is happening. But why do you think that Indigenous women are targeted?
Well, unfortunately, I think on the downtown east side, back in the 90s, I think that the reason is because the women that were going missing were addicted. They had questionable lifestyles or whatever, and so they weren't as valuable in society, just honestly. And we have such a disposable society these days. The paper cups, the paper plates, and certain people groups, and that's that was my personal take on what was happening there. Is we just weren't as valuable.
And today you're here to be their voice. How many women do you think that you know that have been in these circumstances or have met along the way?
Oh, I stopped counting because it just gets too hard. So there's like 4 that come to mind right away. But then I have to really stop myself, because it's right there for me. To begin to think about these things again, it just brings up all the emotion again of their loss. And I know that there are mothers and grandmothers, fathers, grandfathers out there who their family members, missing men and women, and they live with this every day. They live with where is my child, and how do they live with this? How do we live with this? And I think as Native people, how do we survive this? How have we survived things like the residential school, the history of colonization in Canada? And we always like to think that we're, well, at least we're not as bad as the United States. But still, we have some really deep-rooted pain because of the history of colonization. And I honestly, I think one of the best things about our Native people is that we have this resiliency and this sense of humor. And the sense of humor you see in elders who I just got to meet with a couple of elders yesterday, and they made like 250 people laugh just like that, and that kind of it brings out the best, I think, in us. And nobody ever stereotypes Indigenous people in Canada as funny, right? Oh yeah, but so many of our Native people, very, very witty and very clever. And I think that that's sort of the beauty that helps us to get through some of these things is, and that the sense of community, the closeness, and in my community, Natlewaten is where I'm from, Natlewaten First Nation, there are people who, when something bad happens, that people come over, and they just, we don't live in isolation, and the community always comes together when there's grief or trauma, and that's a beautiful thing.
Well, we're watching this inquiry. It's going to take a couple years. And of course, really it's only to find the root causes of why this is happening, systemic causes, in the police, in the government, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. But in the meantime, this continues to go on. And I think sometimes as Canadians, we hear these stories and, we don't want to see women go missing. I would never hurt any woman of any ethnicity. And so it's kind of like, what can I do? I think a lot of Canadians are like, what can I do? What can we do? Is there anything that we can do while, governments are doing their thing? Especially as people of faith, I think. I think we might have a unique role to play here.
Yeah, well, I think the easy answer is to pray, first of all, and I think prayer is very powerful, but then also, let's put some action to our prayers, behind our prayers, and I think that when we really mean something, we get behind things. And I think to be an advocate for Indigenous people issues, certainly to learn more about Indigenous people. We talk about, I always have people trying to talk about sameness, like where do we find our similarities and how can we relate to one another? And I'm always like, I don't know, I just want to talk about our differences, because Indigenous people are so different from the rest of Canada, and the European worldview is so opposite almost of the Indigenous worldview. And so to talk about those things and to be able to celebrate differences and to see the beauty in Indigenous culture and to learn the history of Indigenous people from an Indigenous perspective, that's something that doesn't usually happen. And I just co-wrote a book with Tim Huff where we have a children's book and we talk about some of these issues, and I'm very, very proud of the book because we talk about some things that, just celebrating the beauty, and I think that's important. But again, the differences and acknowledging we're very different from one another. How do we walk together in reconciliation? And it's a day-to-day process. It means a lot of talking, a lot of questions, and I like to try to create a safe place for people to ask maybe really dumb questions. Somebody said there's no such thing as I had a professor said there's no such thing as a dumb question, and I was like, yeah, that's not true. but to
agree with that, yeah.
right? But to have a safe place where you can ask questions that you might be uncomfortable to ask, like I long for people to be able to ask me those things so that I can tell them the truth about Indigenous people, because there's so many misconceptions out there, and yeah.
And that's it. We were talking just before this interview about the idea of the other. When you don't have somebody in your life from a different ethnicity, someone who's disabled perhaps, somebody who's different that you don't have any experience with, sometimes you hold yourself away, sometimes you believe stereotypes, yeah. But it's all about listening. And that's why we did this today, because we want to hear from you. Mm-hmm. We want to listen and we want to learn and we want to build those bridges. So thank you for sharing so beautifully about your people and these women, and we will definitely continue to pray about this, yeah, and raise awareness and advocate and put boots to the ground.
Okay. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Cheryl.